Completing the Square, Part 2. In the last video, we learned how to set up completing the square. In this video, we're going to do some examples of actually setting it up and factoring it into the quantity squared. So I have a few examples of these where we need to figure out that c or constant term. Here they've identified it in the hot pink n. So we need to figure out what that n term is. And once we figure out what that n term is, then we should be able to factor it as a quantity squared. So at this point, we want to do two steps. Figure out what the n is and then factor it completely. Alright, the formula for our n is listed up here. We take 1/2 times our b term and then we square it. So our first step is to figure out what our b term is. It's always the number in front of the x. So our n here is 1/2 times that term squared. Well, 1/2 times 18 is 9, and 9 squared gives us 81. So what we are going to do is we are going to substitute that 81 in for our n term. So now our polynomial is x squared plus 18x plus, making our substitution, 81. Well, we have set this up so it should factor as something quantity squared. So let's factor it. There is no common factor. It is a trinomial. So we start it by our parentheses. Something times something to give us x squared is, of course, x times x. Something times something that multiplies to give us 81 and adds to give us a positive 18 will be a positive 9 and a positive 9. Then that factors as something squared, so this factors as x plus 9 quantity squared. So we have done our two steps in our example. We have found our n term, and then we have used that n term to factor it as a quantity squared. I suggest that you pause the video and see if you can do the same thing with example 2. Figure out what your n term is, and then use that n term to factor it as a square. So our n is 1/2 times our b term. In this example, our b term is negative 13. So 1/2 times negative 13, and then we square it. Now 1/2 and 13 does not multiply out evenly, so what we can do is we can just write it as one fraction. If I put 13 over 1, and then if I multiply straight across, that gives me a negative 13 halves, and then of course I need to square it. Now to square a fraction, you can just square the top. 13 squared gives us 169, and on the bottom, 2 squared gives me 4. So that is my n term. That's what I'm going to substitute in here. That gives me the polynomial of x squared minus 13x plus 169 over 4. Now we should have select the appropriate term such that this factors as a quantity squared. So let's set up our parentheses, x times x to give me x squared, and then I need something times something to give me 169 over 4, but I also need that something plus something to give me my negative 13x. If you have a hard time picking out what that is in this problem, especially since it's a fraction, it's always going to be this number right here, the number that you took before you squared, including the sign. Or if you need help with the sign, if this is a negative, then it should factor as negative. If that first sign is a positive, then it should factor as positive. So whatever that first sign is going to tell you what your sign is. So in this case, it's going to be a negative. And we already picked out the number in our parentheses there. It's going to be 13/2. Now, if you don't believe me that that works out, you can always check this by FOILing it. So let's go ahead and check it in this example. So first, x times x gives us x squared. Outside gives me a negative 13 over 2x. Inside is a negative 13 over 2x. And last, negative times negative gives me positive. And then 13 halves times 13 halves. I just multiply those fractions straight across. So on the top, 13 times 13 gives me 169. And on the bottom, 2 times 2 gives me 4. So this tells me that I have my first thing correct and my last thing correct, but let's double check to make sure that that middle thing works out. If I were to combine these, to add fractions you need a common denominator, which you do, so you just add your numerators. Negative 13 minus 13 gives me a negative 26 over 2x. Then you can reduce this. Negative 26 over 2 divides out evenly to negative 13x. And that is what we had in the middle here. So this does factor correctly. We are not done factoring yet because this is a completing the square, so it should factor as a square. So this is going to factor as x minus 13 halves quantity squared. So we came up with our two parts to this problem. We came up with what our n value is, and we completed the square. I have one more example of these here. Example 3 is x squared plus 47x plus n. Again, we need to figure out what our n value is, and then we need to use that n value to complete the square. I suggest that you pause the video and see if you can work this one on your own. First thing that we need to do is we need to pick out what our b value is so we can plug it in our formula. Our b value is always the one in front of the x. So in this problem, n equals 1/2 times our b value, which is 47, and then we need to square it. Now I need to simplify my inside, and I can do that by reducing. 4 divided by 2 gives me 2 over 1. Now I multiply those fractions straight across. On the top, 1 times 2 gives me 2. On the bottom, 1 times 7 gives me 7. And we need to square it. So square each part individually. 2 squared gives me 4, and 7 squared gives me 49. And that's what my n value is, so that's what I'm going to substitute in for there. Now my trinomial reads as x squared plus 4/7 x plus 4 over 49. Now we need to factor it. So setting up our two sets of parentheses, because this is a trinomial with no common factor, we have x times x to give us our x squared. Then we need something times something that multiplies to give us 4 over 49, and that adds to give us the 4/7. Remember, it always goes back to this term here before we square it. So it would be 2/7 2/7. Whatever your sign is here will be the sign that you have there. So these are both positive. Now, if you don't believe me that this factors correctly, go ahead and check it on your own by FOILing it. So first, x times x gives me x squared. Outside gives me a positive 2/7 x. Inside gives me a positive 2/7 x. And last, I have positive 2 times 2 gives me 4, over 7 times 7 gives me 49. We need to simplify this here. We have a common denominator of 7, so we add our numerator. 2 plus 2 gives me 4, over my common denominator of 7x. And that matches with what we had in the middle up here. So that did factor correctly. So what we need to do is we need to put that in quantity squared format. So at this point, we have set up the completing of the square. This is where I'm going to stop this video, but in the next video, we are going to start to solve quadratic equations by using this process.